In the early morning hours of November 28th, 1973, in Rochester, New York, the city awoke to another chilling discovery. The lifeless body of 11-year-old Michelle Maenzo was found in a ditch alongside a rural road. She was the third young girl to be murdered in the region within a span of 10 months. The three victims, Carmen Colon, Wanda Volkovich, and now Michelle, were all young, had been abducted in broad daylight, assaulted, and then murdered. But it wasn't just the brutality of the crimes that unsettled investigators. It was the eerie similarities between the cases. All three victims had first and last names that began with the same letter: Carmen Colon, Wanda Volkovich, and Michelle Mainza. And each body was found in a town starting with the same letter as their names: Churchville, Webster, and Macedon, respectively. The media quickly dubbed it the Alphabet Murders. These horrifying cases would eventually push the boundaries of forensic psychology and criminal profiling, and lead to the evolution of FBI profiling as we know it today. At the time, the field of criminal profiling was in its infancy. Law enforcement relied primarily on physical evidence, confessions, and eyewitness accounts. There was no formal methodology to analyze behavioral patterns or construct a psychological portrait of the offender. But the FBI was about to change that. The Behavioral Science Unit, BSU, which was established in 1972 at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, was still a relatively unknown entity. Tasked with studying the criminal mind, the BSU began developing a new way to catch killers, not by what they left behind physically, but by who they were psychologically. Enter Special Agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler, two of the pioneering minds behind modern criminal profiling. The duo, along with Dr. Ann Burgess, a psychiatric nurse and researcher, began conducting interviews with some of the most notorious serial killers in American history, including Edmund Kemper, Charles Manson, and Ted Bundy. They believed that by understanding the minds of these killers, they could learn to predict and identify patterns in other cases. This was a revolutionary idea at the time, using psychology as a forensic tool. The Alphabet Murders in Rochester were among the first cases where this emerging science of profiling would be tested. The local police were overwhelmed. Despite the obvious patterns, there was no clear suspect. The victims didn't know each other, yet they shared striking similarities. All were girls between 10 and 11 years old, all came from low-income Catholic families, and all had some form of learning disability. The killer was clearly organized and meticulous, planning abductions in public places, executing them quickly, and leaving few forensic clues. But most disturbingly, he seemed to be taunting the police, choosing victims whose initials matched the towns where their bodies would be dumped. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit analyzed the case files. Based on the nature of the crimes, they believed the killer was a white male in his late 20s or early 30s, intelligent, methodical, and likely familiar with the local area. He probably had a history of sexual deviance, perhaps even prior arrests. They surmised that he might be someone who worked in a position of trust, possibly a teacher, coach, or delivery driver, someone with access to children and the ability to move around without drawing attention. But profiling wasn't about naming suspects. It was about narrowing the pool. At the time, traditional investigators were skeptical. Many dismissed profiling as little more than educated guesswork. But what they didn't realize was that this approach was grounded in extensive research, case study comparisons, and deep psychological analysis. In the Alphabet Murders, the profile didn't immediately lead to an arrest, but it marked a pivotal turning point. It introduced the idea that a killer's behavior could tell a story, and that story could be used to stop him. The case remained unsolved, but its legacy lived on. The media attention and public fears surrounding the Alphabet Murders pushed law enforcement agencies across the country to reconsider their investigative strategies. Soon, more police departments began consulting the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit for help with complex and seemingly motiveless crimes. By the late 1970s, the concept of criminal profiling had begun to gain mainstream acceptance. Then came another case that would further cement the value of profiling, perhaps the most famous of all, the hunt for the Green River Killer. Beginning in 1982, young women, mostly sex workers, started disappearing in the Seattle and Tacoma area. Their bodies were found in clusters near rivers and wooded areas. There were dozens of victims, and the killer remained elusive for nearly 2 decades. But the FBI profilers believed he was a local man with a blue-collar job, socially awkward, and possibly religious. The eventual arrest of Gary Ridgway in 2001 validated much of the profile. He was a truck painter, deeply religious, and had an extensive history with sex workers, just as the profile had predicted. But perhaps the most famous instance of profiling success came with the capture of David Berkowitz, better known as the Son of Sam. In the summer of 1976, New York City was gripped by fear as a gunman targeted young couples parked in cars. The attack seemed random at first, but profilers identified key elements. The killer was likely a loner, possibly paranoid, and may have a vendetta against women. While the arrest came through a parking ticket, the profile helped narrow the behavioral scope and focus the public campaign. The field of criminal profiling began evolving rapidly in the 1980s and 1990s. The FBI officially formed the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, NCAVC, in 1984, incorporating the behavioral science unit into a broader organization that could handle high-profile cases across the country. Profilers now worked closely with local and state authorities, helping in the hunt for serial killers, arsonists, and even terrorists. Back in Rochester, the Alphabet murders remained a haunting memory. Several suspects were investigated over the years. One of the most compelling was Kenneth Bianchi, who later became infamous as one half of the Hillside Stranglers in Los Angeles. Bianchi had lived in Rochester during the time of the murders and fit many aspects of the FBI profile. However, there was never enough concrete evidence to charge him. Others came under suspicion, but none could be definitively linked to all three killings. The case remains officially unsolved to this day, though it is widely believed the same person committed all three murders. Yet, in many ways, the failure to solve the Alphabet murders was just as significant as solving one. It proved that criminal profiling wasn't magic, it was science. It needed refinement, study, and collaboration. But more importantly, it showed that understanding a criminal's behavior could provide insights traditional methods couldn't. It was the dawn of behavioral forensics, and it would change everything. The legacy of FBI profiling would go on to inspire not just law enforcement practices, but pop culture as well. Movies like Silence of the Lambs, TV shows like Mindhunter, and entire genres of true crime media are built on the foundation laid by the original profilers. They captured the public's imagination with the idea that the mind of a killer could be decoded like a puzzle. Today, profiling is used in cases ranging from child abductions and serial homicides to cybercrime and terrorism. Modern profilers use advanced data analytics, artificial intelligence, and neuropsychology to supplement their work. But the heart of it remains the same: understanding why a criminal acts the way they do, and using that understanding to stop them. The Alphabet murders taught the FBI and law enforcement agencies around the world a critical lesson. It's not always the fingerprints or the DNA that solve a case. Sometimes it's the behavior. Sometimes it's the patterns. And sometimes it's the story a killer tells without even knowing it. That's the essence of profiling. And it's why this case, tragic and unsolved as it has, changed FBI profiling forever. In the decades since the murders, the families of Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle have waited for answers. While justice has not yet been served in the way they hoped, their daughters' cases were not in vain. They ignited a movement within law enforcement that revolutionized how we understand and hunt criminals. Their stories live on, not only in the sorrow of their loss, but in the breakthroughs their cases inspired. And for every life saved by a profiler's insight, a piece of justice echoes back to those girls. The path from the fields of Rochester to the halls of Quantico was paved with grief, determination, and innovation. The tragedies of 1973 became the foundation for a future where killers could no longer hide behind randomness. Because now, someone was watching. Someone was listening. Someone was building a profile, and that made all the difference.